This is Scituate State of Affairs, discussing town news and town events that have a direct impact on Scituate residents. And that great expansive ocean of ours always creates a lot of chatter around town, and in the coming days, if not weeks, 2 new documentaries will have Scituate residents all abuzz. Inundation District and In the Whale make their Scituate debut this week at the Real Harbor Theater. Inundation District dealing with rising sea levels and the impact it has on communities and its residents. And In the Whale, the incredible story of a fisherman while fishing off the coast of Provincetown was swallowed by a whale. That fisherman didn't die. Take a look at a clip.
Michael Packard came home from the hospital with one incredible story to tell. He was lobster diving off the coast of Provincetown when the world around him suddenly blacked out.
His crewmate couldn't believe what he was watching.
He actually was in there trying to figure out what the to do.
The sea has saved his life, but is also the most dangerous thing in his life.
I'll tell you, I will never forget that sight as long as I live.
I said, "What you think about Michael?" He said, "Mom, I thought it was over."
David Abel is the award-winning director behind both films. He's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Boston Globe. He's also a professor at Boston University. David, a man of many talents.
I'm just busy.
Yes, you are. You are busy. You're a very, very busy man. I'm so glad you're able to swing by here. You were just at a screening for one of these movies. And by the way, both these movies, absolutely fascinating. So on point with the town of Scituate and all coastal towns dealing with rising sea levels and have a fishing community. And we're going to talk about those here in a second. But you yourself are fascinating. A very well-respected journalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the Boston Globe. Give us your brief bio.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. It's great to be here. So I have been a reporter at the Boston Globe for 25 years. It's a mouthful. And recently started teaching as a professor of journalism at Boston University, which, by the way, is a very humbling experience. And I've been moonlighting as a filmmaker for now about a decade. I got into making films as a result of the Boston Marathon bombings when I was on the finish line. It's a long story, but it led to my first 2 films, and I have covered the environment and climate change for now many years at the paper, and have made a series of films about climate change, culminating arguably with this film, Inundation District, which seeks to make clear that climate change is not some distant abstract threat, but one that presents a clear and present danger right now, one that we are already experiencing.
We're going to go into detail more about that movie, but I just want to touch briefly, because we did just have that Boston Marathon. You won the Pulitzer Prize 2014 for it, when the bombings themselves were in 2013. But and it helped you transition a little bit. Those served as good material to transition into this filmmaking from this print journalist. And it got me wondering a little bit about this transition itself and just the media. You know, you and I have been working in the media, print, TV, for the last 2, maybe three decades. Mm-hmm. we're not young bucks anymore.
Yeah.
and you know, we had during that time we had the experience to see this industry dramatically change. The way people wanted their information, consumed it, and so outlets had to adjust and transition, and so did journalists. So I'm a little curious as to as you transitioned into becoming a filmmaker, do you think it was strategic or was it just your natural path?
So, I mean, I don't know what my natural path was. So I long had I would say, a prejudice against the visual medium. I long felt like TV news and a lot of visual journalism sort of dumbed down storytelling, and just thought that it was not a very compelling means of telling a story. And that started to shift over the years as we were increasingly, as our very pulp product, the newspaper, became more of a multimedia institution. I was encouraged to experiment with the old school flip video cameras and and I started to get a taste of what this medium could be when it was done in certain ways. And then one day I was working on a story about how people live on Boston Harbor in boats covered in shrink wrap throughout the winter. And I thought I had a really compelling story that I was writing. And we just hired our first full-time video journalist at the Boston Globe, and she made a short film or video to accompany the story that I wrote. And when they were both published together, I was blown away by what she was able to capture. She was able to show things that I could only hint at in print. It was so cold, you could see the condensation, blooming from people's mouths as they spoke. You could see the sallow light in this boat that just sort of reflected the dismal conditions these people were living in. You could hear the howling of the winds and the creaking of the boats against the dock. And I was just really moved, and it impressed upon me how visceral this medium can be when it is done thoughtfully, and that drew me into this. And then I was able to do something called a Neiman Fellowship, where you get to spend a year, take a year off from your normal job, and I got to spend a year at Harvard studying anything I wanted. And I was able to get into a documentary film class. And I knew nothing about how to use a camera. I knew nothing about the grammar of making films, but I was just interested in learning more about this art form, about this form of storytelling. And then for the final project for that class, I was making a short film about the first little person to run the Boston Marathon. And I spent a few weeks or months really filming her. And then on the day of the marathon, I was with her while she was getting ready. I went to the starting line with her in Hopkinton. I went to the halfway point, and then I went to the finish line. And I was waiting there trying to capture what I thought was going to be the triumphant ending of this film, when all of a sudden, as I was still sort of fiddling around with this camera, trying to figure out exposure and white balance and all these things I didn't understand, about 15 or 20 steps from where I was standing, the first bomb exploded. Wow. And if you've ever seen any of the aftermath of the footage of the aftermath of the bombings, you've probably seen the footage I shot that day. And that led me to my first film, and then I spent the next year continuing to follow that subject. I ran the marathon with her on the first anniversary of the marathon bombings, and then I made my first feature film, and then I was just sucked in, and then went back to my beat after a year of covering the aftermath of the bombings to covering climate change and environmental issues, and continued to make films about environmental issues.
Yeah, and here you are with these two movies. Let's talk about them. Let's wade into some dangerous waters, pun intended, with the first one, Inundation District. Take a look at a clip.
The changes that have taken place and permissions that have been given for people to build in the coastal zone and around the water's edge without taking in consideration the long-term impacts is of real concern to me.
We had developers come in, build buildings, and then get out 5 years later.
There was no attention paid to sea level rise, absolutely none. This place is going to be subject to devastation, and the building continues.
So this movie really focuses mainly on the Seaport District in Boston. Tell us what you found.
So over the years, I have covered as a reporter covering climate change, I have covered report after report after report about projections relating to how our seas are going to rise. And every report, it seemed like the projections would get worse. And then a few years ago, I covered a report that suggested that the worst case scenario was likely to be 50% worse than the previous report that was published by scientists at the University of Massachusetts in Boston about what seas are likely to rise to in Boston Harbor. The worst case scenario was an incomprehensible 15.5 feet of sea level rise. And at the same time, like a lot of people who live in Boston, I was experiencing this great cognitive dissonance in the sense that I was watching as we were building an entirely new urban district, spending billions of dollars building this new urban district at sea level, on landfill, hard on the coast, in a city that has more climate scientists per capita than just about any other city on the planet. And we were building this new neighborhood in arguably the bullseye of rising seas. And I was just amazed as I was reading these reports and watching how we were building this new neighborhood, what was going on. And I was trying to make sense of that. And I thought, maybe if I could make a film that used the seaport as a prism to look at the challenges of coastal development at a time when we know the seas are rising, maybe that film would be worthwhile. Maybe that film would open people's eyes to the facts that we are not living in a world where we can just ignore these threats. These are existential threats to our future and to our children's future.
In an interview you did regarding this film, you talked a little bit about, in the film, presenting sort of both sides, the climate activists, the business developer side too. And I'm wondering about the individuals that are really driving that economy. I mean, you probably well know, as I do, the seaport's hot. It's, you know, people go there to see it. They want to be seen there. They want to party there. They want to drink there. They want to eat there. They want to live there. And so from a business perspective, it's what the people want. It's smart business. So when we think about that, what responsibility do you think have the individuals that are really driving that economy have?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, we had this area that for decades, for practically a century, was essentially abandoned warehouses and parking lots. And the city had just spent billions of dollars cleaning up Boston Harbor. And nobody wanted to live there or work there or develop there because it was essentially, the harbor was more or less an open sewer. It stank, and it was filthy. But once it had been cleaned up, all of a sudden there was this valuable waterfront property, and the city, in a fully reasonable way, thought we should develop this. We should, you know, generate property tax revenue from this. But what they didn't do is develop it in a way that would withstand what the projections even back then suggested were grave threats to this new neighborhood, which is built on landfill.
Sure.
And so the state, the city, provided tax incentives to developers, and they called it the Inundation District, and they persuaded a lot of developers to build there, and a lot of companies, Fortune 500 companies, to build there. And they have succeeded in creating a new neighborhood that you could say is vibrant. And yet it floods significantly when we have a major storm. We saw that in 2018. We saw this in January, when we had the fourth highest tides on record in January, you know, just a few months ago. You had some major flooding here in Scituate. So we don't know, you know, if Hurricane Sandy hit Boston, I think just an hour or two earlier, much of downtown Boston would have suffered catastrophic damage, just like New York and coastal New Jersey did. And that could happen at any time now.
I want to go back to a quote that you alluded to, because I wrote this down in one interview that said that again, the Seaport District is really what you focus on in this movie. But you said the Seaport District is just a prism to look at all kinds of vulnerable coastal cities, and I'll add in towns, because as you've said, Scituate, this is a massive issue for Scituate here, and it's a very polarizing debate.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, we do have a large percentage of people living along the coast, business, homes, residents, and they pay taxes, and they're like, the town needs to take care of us. They need to do a better job with like seawalls, protecting the beach erosion. And then you have a percentage that lives inland, and they think like, look, we're spending so much money, the town is spending so much money, effort, time to protect these homes that they feel are just irresponsible to live there. What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. I've actually just been looking into this very issue here in Scituate for a story that I've been reporting for the Globe, and it reflects on how we have in this state more than 500 so-called severe repetitive loss properties. This is a term from the National Flood Insurance Program of properties that have repeatedly received money from this federal program, this federal insurance program, to rebuild. And there are, I believe, a third of those properties in Scituate, in the state. And on average, I think, I don't remember exactly, so I shouldn't probably say, but each of those properties has received money from the federal government to rebuild in the same place multiple times, in some cases 6 times, sometimes 8 times. So the question that I think the residents of Scituate have to ask, the questions that the residents of Boston and the Seaport have to ask is, who ultimately should foot the bill? That is the fundamental question of Inundation District, which is in a world where we are building in flood zones, should we all collectively have to pay for that? And should there be incentives to continue to rebuild when we know that the seas are rising and that they are going to be rising at an accelerating rate?
Let's move on to the second movie, and frankly, this story just sells itself. It's called In the Whale. Take a look at a clip.
All of a sudden, he let me go, and I started crying because I was so thankful that I escaped death yet again.
Okay, so I got to say that I'm in the barbershop last week getting my hair cut, and I'm telling the guys about this movie, and like in this interview I'm about to do, they're going crazy. Everyone's talking, everyone remembers this story, and making jokes about it, because it's just it's somewhat comical hearing this story. But when you watch the trailer for this movie, it has this very somber tone. Tell us about how this came about.
So, so I have covered all kinds of stories about our marine ecosystem here in New England over the years. I have made a film called Lobster War, which is about lobstermen. I made a film, my last film, called Entangled, all about North Atlantic right whales. And so all of a sudden, when there was a collision between a whale and a lobsterman, I was interested in that story, and I was asked to write about it by my editors at the Globe, who, like a lot of people at the time, were skeptical about this fish story. There was, you know, a lot of thoughts that this was probably, you know, not likely to be true, and so I was asked essentially to debunk it. And so I did what any reporter would do. I tried to talk to as many people as I could who knew the fisherman. His name is Michael Packard. I interviewed his mother. I interviewed his sisters. I interviewed the fisherman who allegedly pulled him from the water. And I interviewed Michael Packard. And I had the sorry task of having to go back to my editors to tell them that, unfortunately, I believed the story and I thought it was true. And the next day, the Globe ran a front page story about Michael Packard's experience that probably had the best headline to ever accompany a story I've ever written. And I can't take credit for it because we don't write the headlines. But it said, "This fish story isn't hard to swallow." And you know, after in the course of reporting that story, I explained to Michael that I moonlight as a filmmaker, and I'd be interested in talking to him about possibly telling a deeper story and making a film about his experience, which would take a lot more time than a newspaper article.
Yeah, that's interesting because I thought about that. You made this movie around this one moment. There's no footage of it. I mean, it was. So how do you create an entire movie around that?
That is just really the jumping off point for this film. This film, and that question you're asking is the question I was asking myself when I was thinking about whether or not I should make a film about this. The central question was, what else is there left to say? There'd been so much. This story ricocheted all over the world. There'd been so much out there about this, and I wasn't sure what the answer to that question was until I got invited to go out with him and spend a day with him at sea, watching him do what he does, which is put on a scuba tank and dive repeatedly, come up with this bounty of lobster. And I got a sense of him and thought there was a story about why this guy does what he does, and why he's continuing to do what he does despite the very clear danger, not from whales, but from great white sharks which inhabit the area. And I thought, if I could tell a story about what it is like for a human being to go through this experience, which is perhaps one of the most frightening things that I could possibly imagine happening to someone, being engulfed in the mouth of another species, and then tell the story of what happens to someone like this man who is a reclusive fisherman over time when the spotlight fades. Maybe that would be an interesting story. And so I spent 2 years essentially following him, and In the Whale is the fruition of that time.
I'm sure you spent a lot of time within the fishing community itself. What did you learn about that community?
So, in a lot of ways, I would say this film is a love letter to the Outer Cape, to Provincetown, to Cape Cod at large. I got to spend a lot of time there over the past 2 years and really appreciate it in a way that I had not experienced before. The fishing community, which is sometimes not even thought of when you think about Provincetown, plays a huge role in the history and in the present of this community. And the film tries to reflect that in a nuanced and hopefully compelling way.
The film is playing at the Real Harbor Theater this weekend. You're doing a Q&A, the Saturday performance following that show. When viewers finish this movie, what do you want them feeling or thinking about?
That is a great question. I think that one of the takeaways is that we don't know what will happen, 5 minutes from now. And so we have to hold on to what we cherish and take advantage of the time that we have and make the best of our lots in life, because who knows when you're going to get swallowed by a whale, or who knows, what might happen, you know, when you walk out the door, when you leave your house. And ultimately, I think this is a love story. And I think I will let it rest there, and for folks to understand why it's a love story, they should come and see the film.
It's fantastic. I need to save this question for last because it might harm our relationship here. But it's called In the Whale, with that tagline, the best fish story ever told.
Greatest
fish story ever told. It's just that whales aren't fish, they're mammals. So,
you are not the first person to mention that.
I know.
But the word, look,
I get it.
You can finish your question.
No, that's it. That's it.
So yes, I'm aware that whales aren't fish, but you know, if you go back to the Bible and you go to the story of Jonah, Jonah is not swallowed by a whale. He is swallowed by a great fish. And this is a quintessential fish story that just happens to also be true, even if it's about a whale or a mammal. I think there is enough room for using that.
A little
phrase.
flexibility there.
We had lots of discussions about this.
I know, and I chatted with some people too. I'm like, look, should I bring that up? I mean, is that going to create conflict? You got to get out of here. One more question. Young journalists, young filmmakers, what advice do you have for them?
Just do it. Like, you know, the old Nike ads used to say, it ultimately comes down to telling a great story. And you need to practice. You need to sweat the details. You need to talk to as many people as you can, and you need to learn the craft. And the only way you can do that is by trying, failing, and trying, and getting better over time. I started out as a print reporter. I still make a lot of mistakes when I'm out there filming. Sometimes I forget to put the audio on. Sometimes my exposure is terrible. Sometimes something is out of focus. But if you practice, you will get better. And if you are motivated to make something happen, and this is something you are really passionate about, it will get done. It might take time. It might take a lot of false starts, but keep at it. And hopefully you will meet the ambitions that you aim to achieve.
Fantastic, fantastic. David Abel, appreciate you being here. And remember, folks, Inundation District and In the Whale playing this week at the Real Harbor Theater.